Magna Carta. Nah, sorry. Had to start this off with a little bit of something, but welcome to, of course, the house and loads of laundry piles. For any of you that follow my wife's Instagram, you know that we always are big on folding our laundry and then never putting it away. Now, the big thing, though, going into it, is we left off in class talking about a bunch of stuff, and I know this is Halloween weekend, so I am going to try to keep this thing a little bit shorter, and we're going to try and hustle through some stuff, right? So we can actually have Monday to just, review, right? So the big thing about it is we left off talking about Charles II, right? We were talking about the reign of Charles II, the third Stuart monarch of England, following the Commonwealth period in Cromwell, right? So we know that his rise to power was a really interesting one in the sense that he was on the run in France for a while with his mom, Henrietta de Maria, right? And his brother, James. And then he gets called back to Scotland and they appoint him king, and then he fights another civil war against Cromwell and loses, hides in a priest hole, becomes secret Catholic. Very important story, right? Now, other big thing, though, is he does get married, never has any kids, though, because his two favorite loves in life are tennis and women, right? So, and he couldn't just be with one woman, apparently. So, Braganza, her name was, Charlotte de Braganza, ends up, going back to Portugal and never sees him again, but they never get divorced because, she's pretty hardcore about, not doing that. So, he ends up having a bunch of illegitimate children. A couple of them were with, actresses. Apparently that was his favorite type of woman. Women were actresses. So the big thing, though, going into it is we also know a couple of other things. Charles's reign, his early reign, was fraught with challenges, right? He had started ruling at the era right around 1660, right? So... And by 1665, everything kind of just hits the fan, right? So the plague breaks out in London, which leads to 7,000 people dying per week. As you can see right here, the plague of London was absolutely awful, okay? So, and this is just another way to remember that the plague didn't just go away in the Middle Ages, right? It kept reoccurringly coming back over and over and over again through different waves. And so one of the interesting things, though, is also, if you look back even Shakespeare's era, half of his troupe was killed by a bout of plague that actually broke out in England at the time. So this plague is going to actually have dramatic effects, though, on the scientific world as well, because remember, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment are going on in the background of this whole thing, kind of in the backdrop where it's absolutism, constitutionalism, and then on the background it's beakers and stuff. Now, the thing about it, though, is the Great Plague of London actually drove this guy out of town, right? He actually moved out of town to avoid dying from the plague or contracting it, and that guy's name is Sir Isaac Newton. Well, he wasn't Sir yet. The last Stuart monarch, Queen Anne, is going to be the person that actually makes him a knight, but he was just Isaac Newton at the time. And he went out to his family's country estate, and out there they had an apple orchard, and it was at that apple orchard while he was trying to avoid the plague that he saw an apple fall, and he came up with the theory of gravity, right? So, big things, though, also on top of that, less than a year after the Great Plague of London, the Great Fire of London breaks out, right? Destroys 13,200 homes and 87 different, old churches throughout the city of London. The Fire of London was absolutely horrific, and Charles had to deal with that in his 6th year of being king, which is absolutely wild. And apparently the entire thing started on a place called Pudding Lane. Pudding Lane. That's awesome. Now, anyway, but then also on top of it, you have to understand, too, that, with this whole thing, a lot of it had to do with the garbage design of London at the time, right? It was mostly designed with wood homes, and then there also the westerly winds were coming through and blowing the fire through London, so much of it was completely destroyed. Catholics would be immediately blamed. One man would be falsely hanged, when it actually had to do with the fact that on Pudding Lane there was a bake shop, and the fire broke out and started there, right? Another big thing, though, also going on during his reign, is he's going to war. He's got these things called the Anglo-Dutch Wars that he's got to deal with, due to the fact that Oliver Cromwell couldn't just calm down and be chill about stuff. And we will talk about the Dutch as well in this flip, because they are very, very important. But the Anglo-Dutch Wars are going to break out mostly because the Dutch are going through a golden age, right? The Dutch are going through a huge golden age time period. They're extending their trade further and further and further, going all the way to North America, doing all this different stuff. And so he gets swept up into these wars that there had actually been a couple even before this, right? They actually had started in 1652, 8 years before his reign ever even came about, but he does end up fighting, I believe, in the Second and Third Anglo-Dutch War, right? So this is linked to the Navigation Acts due to the fact that Oliver Cromwell, that is why he said you must trade on British boats, because actually a lot of American colonists were trading on Dutch boats because Dutch boats could bring them tea and other items much cheaper, right? So big thing, though, on top of all this, linked to those Dutch wars, is Charles was failing at some of these Anglo-Dutch wars, and he desperately needed more help. He desperately needed more help when it came to naval power and supremacy, and he needed more help fighting the Dutch off, right? And so he was then not even backed into a corner, but he used this as a reason to sign an alliance with his cousin, Louis XIV, right? Real quick, just because I know that, Morgan Gode really likes to know, people's ages and stuff whenever we're talking about these things. I think I've said this child's name more than 1,000 times in, flips just because, I need to make sure that we're all, on the same page. So looking at this whole thing really quick, Charles II was born in 1630. So by the time he signs this alliance, it's going to be 1670, so he's going to be about 40 years old. And I believe Louis was born in 1648. Come on, be right on that one. 1638. 1648 is the 30 Years' War. So they're about 8 years apart in difference, okay? So Louis would have been in his 30s, his early 30s by this time. He would have already built Versailles. He would have been fabulously wealthy. His mercantilistic economy would have been blowing up, and he would have been an absolutist in France. And so one of the big things about this alliance was he said, fine, I will aid you and help you in the Third Anglo-Dutch War. I will send my navy. We will come and help you. We will suppress these people because the French believed that they were going to be able to make some progress off this as well. But due to this thing, you have to meet my alliance provisions, right? And so some of these alliance provisions were pretty intense and pretty hard for Charles to follow through with. But one of the big ones was that Charles had to agree to publicly convert to Catholicism because Louis knew that he was secretly a Catholic, but he had to agree to publicly do it to ease anti-Catholic restrictions in England, right? So big thing he's going to try to do is he's going to try and pass this thing called the Declaration of Indulgence. Now, a declaration can come directly from the king, right? This is kind of like when James tried to outlaw tobacco and no one listened, though. The Declaration of Indulgence was a toleration of Catholics and other nonconformist Protestants, as in Puritans, Catholics, and anyone who's not Anglican. And so with that, though, Parliament then takes the declaration in, withdraws it completely, and then forces him to sign this thing called the Test Act. And this is actually while Charles is getting paid a royal allowance from Louis, right? A royal allowance being he's getting money from Louis to be able to do all these different things, right? But Parliament withdraws the Declaration of Indulgence and forces him to sign the Test Act. Now, the Test Act is going to be very important later on. The Test Act is signed instead, which barred anyone from Parliament or public service that was Catholic. If you got found out to be Catholic, you would be taken away from the Parliament and you would be forced to resign. If you got found out to be Catholic and you were in any kind of public office, you would be forced to resign, right? So the Catholics were actually being way worse. And these conflicts, amongst other things, like the Dutch Wars, the Fire of London, the Great Plague of London, the Test Act, all these different things, leads Charles to having a very emotionally sordid life. Again, we talked about this earlier, how he was secretly a Catholic and he wanted to come out and actually acknowledge his true faith. And that might have led him to actually being a massive alcoholic, a womanizer, and also being somebody who distracted himself through the daily life with other kind of vices in general, right? And with this sordid life, this stress would actually lead to him dying in 1685 from a stroke, right? So now, really quick though, in 1685, he would have been about 55 years old, which is still a pretty young death for a king. And we will talk about specifically how he died a little bit later on when we get to the scientific revolution, because the way he died is absolutely hilarious, but I don't want to use it right now because I want to use his death as a way to show you how slow medical technology was still coming along by this time period, right? But Charles II dies after signing that Test Act, because I believe that goes through in 1673. Let me double check that really fast, though, because you don't need to know the thing. It's just mainly, 1673. So about 13 years later, he dies because he can't figure out a way to come out publicly as Catholic, but he did actually completely convert to Catholicism, and he died a Catholic man because he took his first communion on his deathbed and was blessed by a priest on his deathbed, right? So now with this, though, because Charles never had any kids, James II is now going to be coming to the throne of England. James II is his brother, and he comes to the throne after his death. James violates the Test Act deliberately, because whereas Charles was secretly a Catholic, James came out openly as Catholic during his reign in England.
With the Don't Formula shampoo and use cream rinse for that Just Wash shine. I can't seem to find my toothbrush, so I'll pick one up when I go out today. Other than that, I'm in good shape.
I know, that's how everybody else in England felt too. The Parliament was just like, what are you doing? They were very upset about this, right? So James appoints Catholics to high offices and positions in the army, directly violating this Test Act that Charles had to sign. So this means that Parliament is about to get some authority to do some stuff, right? So because they're like, you're violating this act that goes against the people that we passed. I'm sorry I'm singing, but it makes complete sense. So, like, there's James right there. Very, very, very Catholic. Looking a lot like Louis XIV in this picture, whenever you really think about it. So, big thing is now that Parliament feels that this king is violating royal appointments, that they will not be charged with treason if they try to figure out a way to get him to stop, right? So, fearing a return to Catholicism, Parliament convinces James II's daughter, Mary, who is Anglican, who is pictured right here, who is married to this man from the Dutch Republic. Isn't it ridiculous how, like, you can have, like, 4 wars with a country and then randomly just be like, you want to help us out? Like, so, like, and then, like, people just let it go. So, like, now the thing about it, though, is Parliament convinces his daughter, Mary, and her Dutch husband, William, to show up and challenge James, right? James thought in his mind that there's no way that William would be able to show up and send him away. There's no way, because he's like, I've appointed Catholics to high offices in the military. No one's going to touch me. Blah, 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 blah. Also, my son, who will be James III, will be taking over, and he's already been baptized Catholic. This is going to be ridiculous. Blah, 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 blah. And so what ends up happening is William and Mary land in England with a massive Dutch army. And no one does anything to stop them at all. No one does anything. They just watch him show up. And what ends up happening is James flees like a pansy to France and abdicates the throne out of fear, because he's telling all these officers, go out there and meet them. Stop them from destroying this. Do that. And all of them are like, nah, man, I don't want to do that. You're messing up this whole Parliament thing we got going on right now. You're trying to do this again. You're trying to send us into a civil war again, and we're not about to let that happen, right? So all of his officers just didn't listen to him. And so James II, King of England, fled to France, where his cousin Louis XIV was still ruling, in a rowboat. He left in a rowboat. The King of England rowed his way across the English Channel to France. The King of England has been run out of town, right? And not a drop of blood was shed. And because of this, his daughter, Mary, because of the Third Succession Act of 1543, now gets the ability to assume the throne as Queen of England, alongside of her Dutch husband, William III, a.k.a. William of Orange, right? So William and Mary's bloodless ascension to the throne, because no one died, is known as the Glorious Revolution, right? So with this, they're going to pass an extensive amount of acts. And William and Mary kind of bring in this final Band-Aid onto this whole, let's try this absolutism thing in England. When William and Mary come into power, they finally heal the country completely, and they are like, we will work directly with Parliament. We will split the power between Parliament and King, and there will not be any of this chaotic stuff going on anymore. There's not going to be any of this, we think we have more power than you, the Parliament thinks that they can do this, that, and the other. And so they basically agree to forever share the Parliament power and the kingly power together. Parliament also, because of the Triennial Act, which will be re-ratified, gets called at least once every 3 years, bare minimum. Nowadays, it's yearly, right? They also ratify the English Bill of Rights. Now, this one is phenomenally important. The English Bill of Rights is a very important document, because when you look at all these documents, going backwards, right, you have to understand that the English Bill of Rights solidified the basic rights of people in England underneath their government. Rights to free, and this English Bill of Rights is super important because it would lead directly to the establishment of the U.S. Bill of Rights a little bit later. The English Bill of Rights included several different addendums to this document that outlined all of James's misdeeds against the crown and why it was okay that he rowed his boat all the way over to the English Channel. And then it also established that William and Mary would be co-rulers together, not one over the other, right? And it also solidified people's ideas and their freedoms to do the following things. Freedom to elect the members of parliament that they wanted to without the king or queen's interference. Freedom of speech in the parliament. Freedom from royal interference with law. Freedom to petition the king. Freedom to bear arms for self-defense. Freedom from cruel and unusual punishment. That's a big one. Freedom from taxation by royal prerogative without the agreement of parliament. Freedom of fines and forfeiture without a trial. Freedom from armies being raised during peace times, right? These different ideas that just show up and say the parliament isn't its own entity. It is a representative body of the people, and you cannot touch their power. And the king has their own powers as well, but that is that they are to be kept separate from one another, right? Law also could not be suspended by the crown at all, as what I just read in the English Bill of Rights, and crown could not interfere with debates or sessions of parliament. And we'll talk about the opening of parliament when we get to class. It's absolutely adorable. It's so funny. Now, getting into this whole thing a little bit further, is you got to understand, it's the English Bill of Rights. And then before that, there was the Petition of Right, saying that, Charles could not violate the powers of parliament, and that he couldn't just arrest people without cause. And then before that was the all-important document, the Magna Carta. Yay! Exactly, right? So these three documents go together to basically create the modern Constitution of England, right? And the English Bill of Rights was that really last big one. And so looking at this entire thing, you've also got, again, the sparks and the fires of the Enlightenment are beginning, right? So you've got this entire concept of England going through and fighting against its own constitutional government and this wealthy aristocracy versus this new gentry class, and we'll talk about that here in a second too, going against each other and trying to and it's inspiring a movement called the Enlightenment. And the very first Enlightenment thinker was Thomas Hobbes that we talked about, right? He wrote the Leviathan. He's saying that you need a supreme absolutist. We don't really know if Hobbes liked Cromwell or not. It's kind of hard to read, but basically saying that people are scum and they're disgusting and but this guy shows up who ends up being the exact opposite of Thomas Hobbes, and he looks on to William and Mary as being phenomenal rulers of England because they outlined one of the most important things that mankind has. Inalienable rights, right? Because this is the thing. John Locke, this man right here, the second hero of the Enlightenment, defended the political ideas of the Glorious Revolution in his book known as The Second Treatise of Government, right? And we'll talk more about his ideas later on when we get to the Enlightenment. We'll talk about tabula rasa, and we'll talk about all that stuff. But this entire thing discusses that William and Mary's ascension to the throne represent the protecting the ideas of life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, which he believed to be a natural right, right? And natural rights are these things that are inalienable to every person. You have the right to speech. You have the right to religion. You have the right to own property, right? You have the right to liberty and freedom against a tyrant, because he believes that under a tyrant that people have the natural right to rebellion. That's his version of the social contract, saying that I have rights, the king is supposed to protect those rights, and if they don't, then I can overthrow you deliberately, right? So we're seeing the seeds of revolution as well, Abigail Winningham, being sprinkled all throughout Europe, and these revolutionary plants will begin to grow over time, right? And so John Locke happens to be one of the most important Enlightenment thinkers. You definitely need to know that guy, right? Now we're going to switch gears again. So you're going to switch gears, we're going to leave England behind, and that's the constitutional reign inside of England. Then we have another constitutional government that we're going to talk about real quick, and that is the constitutional government of the Dutch Republic, right? Now, the Dutch Republic, so we're going to be going all the way backwards. Hold on one second. Hello. I'm flipping. How are you? Okay, I'll see you in a second. All right, love you. That is the laundry folding queen herself right there. She is on her way home. But the big thing, though, is the Dutch Republic in the 17th century is majorly important, okay? So now, as we know, a quick review, the Dutch are going to liberate themselves from Spain and Philip II. I could talk all day long about the 12 provinces of the Dutch Republic and the Peace of Utrecht and all this other stuff and the 80 Years' War, but I don't want to. All right, so like all you need to know is that Spain originally controlled the Dutch. Oh, and the Council of Blood. And Philip II originally controlled them. They're going to liberate themselves away because they believed them to be one of several different things, but particularly a devoutly Protestant nation, and did not want to be ruled over by a Catholic overlord or an absolutist, right? But the big thing is, why is this so significant? Why is the Dutch Republic in the 17th century so significant? Because they show up as yet another symbol of the dying concept of feudal monarchs, right? So, like, this is a symbol of the dying aristocracy. Just like in England, the aristocracy kept trying to assert power through Charles, and like the king and his nobles wanted to try and tell the parliament, which represents the common man, and the gentry to be quiet, and the gentry rose up and fought against them and reasserted their rights. This is yet another example of that, right? Because aristocratic standing is dying. Nobles, duches, dukes, barons, like all these other big large earls, like all these other big like nobles, their power is waning, right? Because they're not keeping up with the times. Yes, they still own land. Yes, they're crazy wealthy. Yes, there's still robe and sword nobles and all this other stuff going on over in France. Yes, those things still exist, but their power is incrementally going down, and it's transferring over to this new middle class, a gentry. This gentry is like the bourgeois, right? They're people that are working hard for their money, rising up through the ranks. They are merchants. They are agricultural revolutionary workers. They are the rising middle class, the seeds of the middle class, right? Now, they're still small. They're still smaller than and not as strong theoretically as the aristocracy. But a big thing is the gentry is pulling from the common people below them, and so they feel as though they represent the common man much better. An example is that this was the Glorious Revolution, right? The Parliament convinces William and Mary to come back, run James off, throws the seeds of the Enlightenment inside of this entire thing, and then asserts a co-rulership with William and Mary, who represent the aristocracy, right? Going forward, though, you've also got an example of this glorious revolution. You've got an example of this known as the Golden Age. The Golden Age of the Dutch Republic, right? So the thing about it, though, depends on who you ask. A lot of historians can't agree on when the Golden Age of the Dutch Republic started, but it's yet another example of this, like, aristocracy dying out and the gentry classes rising up, right? No kings in the Dutch Republic, first of all. No kings, no monarchs. They are believed to be a true republic in the sense that they have elections where they elect these people known as regents. And regents were actually are elected to represent each province in their own version of their parliament. They call it the States General. And at the States General, they vote on who to elect as a person known as the stadtholder. And the stadtholder is like usually a noble or somebody from the aristocratic class that represents as an executive military leader, and they usually are this person known as the Prince of Orange, right? William, Mary's husband William, was a Prince of Orange, right? So he is originally from the Netherlands, and the only reason that he was married to Mary in the first place is due to the fact of, you know, how it is. Female, peace treaties, stuff like that, English, Dutch, let's stop going to war, take my daughter. Now, the big thing, though, also that's uniquely different about the land that is known as the Netherlands from that of being everywhere else in Europe is as of about 1588, they tolerate every religion. And I'm not kidding, every religion. You got the Jewish people in communities in there, tolerated, freely allowed to practice. You've got Calvinist Protestants who are the bulk of the Netherlands society. You've got Puritans that are coming over there. You've got people you've got the Huguenots coming from France whenever, Louis XIV revokes the Edict of Nantes and starts destroying their schools and their property and all this stuff. They flood into the Dutch Republic. But it's key to remember here, some small Muslim families were going to the Netherlands following the Spanish Inquisition. The Netherlands has always been religiously tolerant. And with that, you're giving them a safe haven. And with that, they're bringing their money, their business, their ideas, their intelligence with them to the Dutch Republic. And so you're seeing a dramatic boom in intelligence. One way you could see the growth and intelligence of the Dutch Netherlands is the expansion of a maritime economy, right? They were the only way you will be able to make money in this mercantilistic world is by going out there with a fleet of ships creating a company known as the Dutch East India Company and going out there and getting the spice trade from Central Asia. Write that down. Got like hooked up the spice trade in Central Asia. Then they're going to start going over to North America carrying goods like tea and like shipping tobacco back, which of course leads Oliver Cromwell to signing those navigation acts, right? Because he was like, the Dutch people, they're breaking our prices. Now, like, so all this other stuff, and you can see in the architecture of Dutch cities, they have these gorgeous canals everywhere, right? They actually went from being an agricultural-based economy to building 400 miles of canals all over their cities, right? The Dutch East India Company is an example of that. They are growing and they see huge profits cornered in the shipping market. They were considered the largest shipment providers of anybody else in Europe, right? They built more boats than anyone else in Europe. It's a big reason why when Peter the Great was touring Europe, he wanted to go to the Netherlands, learn how to make these commercial vessels, right? How do I make trade ships that can go over great distances for a very long period of time, right? And look at how beautiful Amsterdam is, just like, oh! And these were built in the 17th century, and they're still there, right? Like, that alone shows the Dutch Golden Age, right? Look at how gorgeous Netherlands is at night. And yes, I know what you're going to say. Can we just take a plane to the Netherlands too? Calm down, all right? Calm down over there. Now, the Dutch East India Company is going to grow and see huge profits. For example, one of these big profits. Now, granted, this was a market bubble, but still, it kind of demonstrates this idea of shipment is that of tulips, right? When the Dutch entered this big event known as Tulip Mania. Tulip Mania was when the price of, like, Dutch tulips grew to be around the neighborhood of something I've been told around $500 a bulb, right? So, like, what happened is when the Dutch East India Company expanded into Central Asia, they discovered these flowers, right? These flowers known as tulips. And look at the price index on these tulips in 1 year from 1637 or 1636 to 1637. When they start being shipped into the Netherlands, people start buying them up like crazy. They become this flower that represents royalty and beauty and gorgeous reprise and all this other stuff. And look at the prices on Tulip Mania. Now, granted, it's a market bubble, right? A bubble is usually going to pop eventually because the supply and demand are going to equal themselves back out again. And also because tulips are bulbs and they'll make more of themselves. You don't need one to make one. You get one, it'll make a field's worth, right? And it's literally why Tulip Mania is a big thing to show you really, really quickly. Tulips in Holland. Look at Holland during tulip season. Now, in mid-April, tulips bloom everywhere in the Netherlands because they brought in so many during Tulip Mania that basically it has become an image and a glorious representation of the Dutch East India Company and trade and progress during this time period, right? Like, look at that. Look at that. Look at the windmills. There's probably some girl with pigtails and clogs like running around over there. Like, look at all that, right? It's absolutely beautiful. But it's just another representation of the growth of the Dutch East India Company during this time period, right? So going forward, though, you also have not only a growth in economics, but this prosperity drives innovation, right? So this guy right here, this is a great example. This guy named Roger van der Heyden is going to be a massive Dutch inventor, right? And this Dutch inventor figured out two things, right? He was like, oh, I'm going to develop a longer burning wick that is going to go into street lights so it will keep streets lit for longer, and that's going to dramatically reduce the amount of crime that happens in Amsterdam because there's more light in the streets, less robbery, less assault, right? Because the burglars and these criminals are now seen and visible at night rather than being slurking through these alleyways in the midst of the dark, right? Van der Heyden also, big thing coming off of the Great Fire of London, realizes that urban fires are a huge problem, so he designed a water pump system that could have an input hose put into the actual canal, and it would actually use a vacuum pressure seal to pump water into the buildings and actually put fires out, right? So that right there is absolutely innovative. And then you also have an explosion, jot this down, an explosion in Dutch art, right? Some of them being the most famous are Rembrandt and Johannes Vermeer, right? So and they didn't paint royal aristocratic people. For the longest time, painters painted royal aristocrats, but instead, Dutch artists painted normal peasants, regular people, because it all goes in line with their Protestant work ethic ideals. This right here is The Milkmaid by Vermeer, which is very, very popular. This one's called the debt, or the evils of luxury, because it goes against the whole concept of frugality and Protestantism, because look at all the beautiful luxurious things this family has around them and all this other stuff, and this over aggressiveness of all this different items, and it's showing that like pigs are coming in and eating all of the waste on the floor, and everyone is like just chaotic and gross and over the top, showing a violation of Protestant work ethic. That right there is Rembrandt's The Night Watch, which is actually considered to be one of the biggest and most beautiful pieces of 15th century art that has ever been seen, right? And then you also have, of course, natural, beautiful landscapes that are going to be being painted during this Dutch Golden Age period. So the Dutch Golden Age, very important, but we'll review that stuff. You guys are working so hard, and we'll go over everything on Monday. I'll talk to y'all soon. This right here is where the test content ends. Y'all have a good one.